The city was alive with tourists, cameras flashing, and people laughing as they walked through the grand square. The historic palace stood tall, its golden gates shining under the afternoon sun. Among the many sights, one thing always caught visitors' attention: the royal guards. They stood tall in their uniforms, faces serious, bodies stiff like statues. No matter what happened around them, they never moved, never smiled, and never reacted. A group of tourists, 4 young men from another country, wandered through the square. They had heard about these famous guards and their discipline. They don't move at all, no matter what, one of them said excitedly. Another laughed. Let's see if that's true. At first, they tried making funny faces in front of the guard, hoping he would laugh. Nothing. Then they waved their hands wildly, pretending to throw things at him. Still, the guard stood firm, eyes straight ahead. People around them chuckled, enjoying the harmless fun. But the tourists wanted more. What if we touch him? One of them whispered. The idea made them giggle. One of them reached out and poked the guard's shoulder lightly. The crowd gasped, expecting a reaction, but the guard remained still, showing no sign that he even noticed. Encouraged by this, the tourists grew bolder. One of them took off his hat and placed it on the guard's head. Another tried to tickle them. Still, no reaction. The crowd had mixed reactions. Some found it amusing, while others felt uneasy. Maybe you should stop, an elderly woman suggested, but the young men ignored her. Then one of them had a wild idea. Let's tie him up, he said with a grin. The others laughed. It sounded ridiculous, but the more they thought about it, the funnier it seemed. They found a rope from a nearby stall and quickly wrapped it around the guard's waist, pulling it tight against a lamppost behind him. The tourists laughed, stepping back to admire their work. The royal guard, now tied to the pole, remained still. His hands stayed at his sides, his eyes staring straight ahead. He didn't struggle, didn't speak, just stood there like a true soldier. People in the crowd had different reactions. Some took out their phones to take pictures, thinking it was just a lighthearted joke. Others shook their heads, knowing this was going too far. A local man muttered, "They shouldn't be doing that." But the tourists were too caught up in their fun to notice. "Let's take a selfie," one of them said, pulling out his phone. They gathered around the tied-up guard, grinning as they snapped pictures. They had no idea that, at that very moment, something was happening behind the scenes. Inside a nearby security office, an alarm had been triggered. A royal guard was being interfered with. And that meant only one thing: immediate action. And action was coming. Fast. The royal guard stood firm, his posture as perfect as ever. Even though the rope around his waist held him against the lamppost, he didn't flinch. His training had prepared him for moments like this. No matter what happened, he was not allowed to break his stance unless given an official order. His duty was to represent discipline, strength, and honor. The tourists kept laughing, pointing at him as if he were a statue instead of a real soldier. One of them waved a hand in front of his face. "Look at him. He's not even blinking." Another clapped his hands loudly next to the guard's ear, expecting some reaction. But the guard remained silent, his face unreadable. A few people in the crowd started feeling uneasy. A young woman whispered to her friend, "This doesn't feel right. He's not allowed to react, but that doesn't mean we should treat him like this." Her friend nodded. "They don't understand how serious this is." Still, the guard did not move. His breathing was steady, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His training had taught him to withstand distractions, discomfort, and even direct confrontation. He was not just a man in a uniform. He was a symbol of the country's history and pride. The tourists, however, saw only a chance for more fun. Maybe he's not allowed to talk, but can he smile? One of them joked. They made exaggerated faces at him, trying to break his expression. When that didn't work, another tried whispering funny words in his ear. Nothing. The guard's discipline was absolute. The sun shone brightly above, casting long shadows on the ground. The noise of the square continued, tourists chatting, pigeons flapping their wings, the distant sound of a street musician playing a violin. But amid all the movement, the guard stood motionless, tied to the post, as if he were part of the city itself. A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why is that man tied up?" he asked, his innocent eyes full of confusion. The mother frowned. "Some people don't respect the rules," she said softly, shaking her head. Then something changed. The atmosphere in the square shifted. A few people noticed security officers near the palace entrance moving quickly, speaking into their radios. Someone in the crowd murmured, "I think they're coming." The tourists were still busy taking pictures, unaware of the silent alarm that had been triggered. They didn't realize that royal guards never stood alone. There were always more watching from a distance, always ready to act if needed. The tourists thought they were playing a harmless game, but they had unknowingly crossed a line. And now, without warning, the situation was about to change. As the tourists continued to laugh and joke around the tied-up guard, the scene began to take a different turn. What they didn't know was that a quiet, unseen system had already started working in the background. The royal guard was never alone, even when he appeared to be standing on his own in the square. There were always other guards nearby, keeping an eye on him and the situation. Inside a small, secure room tucked away near the palace, a group of officers sat in front of several screens. These monitors showed live footage of the square from different angles, including a camera focused directly on the royal guard. They had seen everything from the moment the tourists first approached him. At first, the officers didn't react immediately. The tourists were clearly playing a prank, and while it wasn't ideal, it wasn't enough to justify action. But as soon as they saw the rope being tied around the guard's waist, a clear message flashed across one of the screens. Interference detected. This was a serious violation. The royal guard's job was not just about standing still. It was about maintaining the dignity of the palace and the country itself. Any disruption to his duty, no matter how seemingly innocent, had to be dealt with. Within moments, the officers sprang into action. The quiet, controlled environment of the room turned into a buzz of activity. Phones were grabbed, radios crackled, and orders were relayed. The security team near the palace's main gate had already received the alert, and they were on their way to the scene. Outside, the square's atmosphere remained lighthearted and carefree. The tourists didn't realize how much trouble they were in. They were still posing for photos, their excitement growing as they tried different angles and made silly faces behind the tied-up guard. They had no idea that, just a short distance away, a team of well-trained royal guards was quickly gathering. As they made their way toward the square, the royal guard's backup team remained in perfect formation. The men were dressed in their own formal uniforms, sharp and precise. They were calm and collected, but there was an unmistakable sense of urgency in their steps. They were well trained to handle situations just like this one. The tourists, lost in their fun, barely noticed the squad forming in the distance. The crowd around them, however, did. A few people whispered to one another, pointing toward the approaching group of guards. It was clear that something was about to happen. The lead member of the squad, a tall, strong figure, had a stern look on his face. His eyes were fixed on the tourists, and his movements were calculated, precise. The closer they got, the more the tourists began to sense that their harmless fun might be coming to an end. But still, they didn't fully understand what was unfolding. The lead guard's eyes never left the tourists as he gave a signal to his team. Without a word, the squad continued to move forward with swift purpose. There was no turning back now. The tourists would soon discover just how serious the royal guards were about their duties. The atmosphere in the square began to shift as the squad of royal guards marched forward, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the afternoon. The tourists, still oblivious to the approaching team, were busy laughing and posing for more photos with the tied-up guard. They were in their own world, unaware that things were about to take a serious turn. The squad moved with military precision, their uniforms sharp and their faces stoic. The lead guard, tall and commanding, took the lead as his team followed in perfect formation. There was no rush, but the purposeful strides of the team made it clear. They weren't coming for a friendly chat. They had a mission, and that mission was to restore order. As the squad neared the group of tourists, the crowd around them began to take notice. The mood in the square shifted as people started murmuring, sensing that something was changing. A few onlookers stood taller, some even stepping back to make way for the approaching guards. The tourists, in their excitement, still didn't realize that they were about to face the consequences of their actions. One of the tourists glanced up from his phone, just as the lead guard reached them. He noticed the uniformed men closing in, but it took a moment for him to process the situation. When he finally recognized the seriousness in their expressions, his smile faltered. The others looked up too, suddenly aware that the lighthearted fun they were having might be coming to an end. The lead guard stopped a few feet away from the tourists, his gaze unwavering. His expression remained calm, but his posture told a different story. This was no longer just about protecting the guard. This was about upholding the honor of the royal family, and he was not going to let anyone disrespect that. The tourists finally felt the weight of the situation, and their laughter died down. They weren't laughing anymore. The squad's presence was commanding. The tourists couldn't ignore the silent authority of the guards standing in front of them. The lead guard's eyes never left them as he gave a small but clear nod. His team spread out in a subtle but organized manner, positioning themselves to ensure that the situation wouldn't get any worse. They were ready to act if needed, but their goal was to handle the situation with dignity. The crowd around the tourists had started to part, giving the royal guards more space. Everyone seemed to instinctively understand that they were witnessing something serious. A few people who had been watching from a distance took out their phones, recording the moment as it unfolded. No one knew exactly what would happen next, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The tourists now stood in complete silence, their faces showing a mixture of confusion, realization, and a hint of fear. The lead guard took a step closer and then spoke, his voice steady but firm. "You are interfering with official duties," he said, his words carrying a weight that made the tourists' stomachs drop. The humor was gone now, replaced by a feeling of unease. They had crossed a line, and they knew it. The tourists were no longer in control of the situation. The squad of royal guards had arrived, and with them came the undeniable force of authority. The tourists, realizing their mistake, looked at each other with wide eyes, unsure of what would happen next. But one thing was clear. This was no longer a game. The tourists stood frozen in place, their eyes shifting between one another, their smiles now long gone. The realization of what they had done settled in quickly. The lighthearted fun they had shared just moments ago was now replaced with an overwhelming sense of discomfort. They had no idea how serious this situation had become. The lead royal guard stood in front of them, unwavering. His eyes were sharp, but there was a quiet authority in his gaze that seemed to make the tourists shrink back a little. The silence hung heavy in the air, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of a passing breeze. The tourists tried to speak, but their words seemed stuck in their throats. One of the young men, still trying to salvage the situation, spoke up first, his voice shaky. We didn't mean any harm. It was just a joke," he said, his tone pleading. "We were just having some fun, you know." The lead guard didn't react, his face as serious as before. He didn't seem angry, but the message was clear. This wasn't a situation that could be brushed off with a simple apology. The young man looked around nervously, noticing that people in the crowd had stopped to watch, their eyes all on him and his friends. It was as if the entire square was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Another tourist spoke up, trying to explain. "We didn't know it was such a big deal," he said, his voice rising slightly in nervousness. "We thought it was funny, that's all. It's not like we hurt anyone." The lead guard remained quiet, letting the tourists talk. He didn't need to respond right away. He knew that what had happened wasn't just about a harmless prank. It was about respect for tradition, for the uniform, and for the history that the royal guards represented. These tourists might have thought it was all in good fun, but they had crossed a line, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. The guards' team stood silently behind him, their eyes scanning the scene, ready to step in if necessary. The tourists now realized that their situation had shifted from playful to serious, and their earlier confidence was replaced with nervous glances at each other. They had underestimated how deeply ingrained the royal guard's duties were, and now they were facing the consequences of their actions. The crowd around them watched closely, many of them shaking their heads. Some muttered under their breath, exchanging glances as the tourists fumbled through their apologies. A few people looked disappointed. Others were clearly amused by how the situation had escalated so quickly. But no one, not even the tourists themselves, could deny that the mood had completely changed. The lead guard finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "This is not a place for jokes," he said. "You have interfered with official duties. That is not something that can be taken lightly." The tourists exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that this was more serious than they had imagined. They had expected a simple reprimand or a gentle warning, but this was something different. The lead guard gave them no time to respond. He turned slightly to one of the other guards, who immediately stepped forward. The tourists could now feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. They had no choice but to face the consequences of their actions, and whatever happened next, they knew it wouldn't be easy to shake off. The lead guard's words hung in the air, the seriousness of the moment sinking in for the tourists. Their laughter from earlier now felt like a distant memory, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. They hadn't expected this. Nothing in their wildest dreams had prepared them for a situation like this. They thought they were just playing a harmless prank, but now they could see that it wasn't just about having fun. They had made a serious mistake, and they couldn't undo it. As the lead guard stood tall, his team remained in perfect formation, each one of them exuding authority. The tourists could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. What had started as a silly idea was now something much more serious, and they were left with a sinking feeling in their stomachs. The crowd around them had grown quieter too, as the gravity of what had happened began to settle in. Some onlookers exchanged glances, while others kept their eyes fixed on the tourists, waiting to see what would happen next. The guard who had stepped forward reached into his uniform and pulled out a pair of sharp scissors, quickly cutting the rope that had tied the guard to the pole. The royal guard, now freed, adjusted his uniform in a fluid motion, still standing perfectly upright. His face remained as serious as ever. He didn't say a word or show any sign of frustration, just as his training had taught him. The tourists watched in silence as the lead guard stepped forward again, this time with a calm but firm tone. "You will need to come with us," he said. His words were clear, and there was no mistaking the seriousness of his intent. One of the tourists opened his mouth, perhaps to protest or apologize, but before he could say anything, the lead guard raised his hand slightly. "You've already spoken. It's time to follow us." The tourists stood frozen for a moment, exchanging glances between one another. The reality of the situation finally hit them all at once. There was no more room for excuses or pleading. The fun was over. They had crossed a line, and now they had to face the consequences. One of the tourists, a young man who had seemed the most carefree earlier, took a hesitant step forward. His shoulders were slumped in defeat, the playful energy from earlier now replaced with a deep sense of regret. "We're really sorry," he said quietly. "We didn't mean to cause any trouble." His words hung in the air, but they seemed to fall flat. The guard simply nodded, showing no sign of forgiveness, but not offering any further harsh words either. The lead guard motioned for the rest of his team to surround the tourists as they began to move. The tourists, now no longer laughing or smiling, followed the guards through the square. They could feel the eyes of the crowd still on them, many of the onlookers watching with curiosity as the group made their way toward the security office near the palace entrance. As they walked, the tourists couldn't help but think back on how they had misjudged the situation. What had seemed like harmless fun moments ago now felt like a lesson in respect. They hadn't understood the seriousness of the royal guard's duty, nor had they realized just how much the small act of tying him up had disrupted something far bigger than their joke. They were learning now, but it was a lesson they wished they hadn't had to learn this way. The square that had been full of laughter and excitement now felt cold and distant. The tourists, once carefree and confident, now moved silently, their earlier laughter replaced by quiet regret. They were about to face the consequences, and no matter how much they apologized or tried to explain themselves, the situation had already moved beyond their control. The guards had restored order, and now the tourists would have to deal with the fallout from their actions. The tourists followed the royal guards through the square, their heads down, their steps slower now. They couldn't help but feel the weight of every eye watching them as they walked toward the security office. The laughter and excitement that had surrounded them earlier seemed to be a world away. In its place, there was an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of their shoes tapping lightly on the cobblestones. As they reached the entrance to the security office, a few people in the crowd still watched from a distance, some shaking their heads, others murmuring quietly. The tourists tried to avoid making eye contact with anyone, feeling the sting of embarrassment with every step. They hadn't intended for things to go this far, but now it was too late to take back what they had done. The lead guard signaled for the tourists to stop just outside the door to the office. One of the other guards opened the door and gestured for them to enter. The tourists hesitated for a moment, exchanging uncertain looks, but they had no choice now. They stepped inside, their nervous energy filling the small room as they tried to figure out what would happen next. The room was small but well organized, with monitors showing different angles of the square, as well as a desk stacked with papers and a few security personnel working at computers. The atmosphere was serious, and the tourists could tell that they were no longer in the realm of lighthearted fun. The lead guard stepped inside after them, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. One of the officers at the desk, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her computer. She briefly assessed the tourists and then turned to the lead guard. They exchanged a few quiet words, but the tourists couldn't hear what they were saying. The woman nodded and motioned for the group to sit down at a small table in the corner. The tourists slowly complied, sitting down in uncomfortable silence. They had no idea what would happen next, but they knew it wouldn't be good. They had come to a place they never thought they'd find themselves, in trouble with the royal guards. They had thought they were harmless, but now the situation seemed much bigger than they could have imagined. The officer at the desk stood up and walked over to them. She was calm, but there was a firmness in her movements that made it clear this wasn't a matter to be taken lightly. "Do you understand why you're here?" she asked, her voice steady. The tourists nodded, though none of them spoke. They knew that what they had done was disrespectful, but they hadn't fully understood the significance until now. They had no idea how deep the traditions of the royal guards ran, or how important it was to show respect for their duties. The officer glanced over at the lead guard, who nodded in confirmation. Then she turned back to the tourists. "You have interfered with the royal guard's official duties. You have disrupted the peace and shown disrespect to the symbol of our country. While I understand that you may not have realized the consequences, it is still important to acknowledge that what you did cannot be overlooked." Her words hit the tourists harder than they had anticipated. They were expecting a simple warning or a slap on the wrist, but what they were hearing felt much more serious. The officer paused, allowing her words to sink in. The tourists exchanged looks, their faces a mixture of guilt and regret. They wished they could take it all back. The officer continued, "You will be asked to leave the premises shortly, but this situation is not something that will be easily forgotten. You will be reported, and your actions will be noted. In the future, I hope you will remember the importance of respecting the traditions and responsibilities of those who serve our country." The room was silent after she finished speaking. The tourists sat still, processing what had just been said. The sense of embarrassment and regret was overwhelming. They had no idea how badly their innocent joke had gone wrong, and now they had to face the reality of their actions. They weren't just a group of young travelers anymore. They were people who had crossed a line they hadn't even known existed. The officer didn't say anything more, simply returning to her desk. The lead guard motioned for the tourists to stand, and they did so reluctantly, still unsure of what was to come. As they made their way toward the door, they couldn't help but feel the weight of the lesson they had learned, one that they would never forget. As the tourists walked out of the security office, their heads were still down, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The quiet, controlled atmosphere of the office was a stark contrast to the chaos and excitement they had felt earlier in the square. The weight of the situation was heavier than any of them had imagined. Their playful prank had turned into a lesson in respect, and they couldn't escape the reality of their actions. The lead guard, who had remained silent through most of the process, led the way as they exited the building. His presence was still commanding, but there was no sign of anger, just a calm authority that seemed to resonate with every step he took. Behind him, the tourists followed quietly, their once carefree spirits now subdued by the seriousness of the events that had unfolded. The square outside seemed different now. It was still the same lively place it had been before, but for the tourists, it felt distant and foreign. They had gone from being a part of the fun to being the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. As they passed through the gates, they could feel the eyes of the onlookers still upon them. Some people watched with curiosity, while others glanced at them with a knowing look, as if to say, "You've learned something today." One of the tourists, a young woman, couldn't keep it in any longer. She turned to the others and sighed deeply. "I didn't think it would go like this. I honestly thought we'd just make a funny video and move on." Her voice was soft, but there was a touch of regret in her tone. Another tourist, a man who had been particularly vocal earlier, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, me too. We didn't realize how serious the situation was. I just thought we'd be funny and get a few likes on social media. But now it's something much bigger." The group walked in silence for a while, each of them reflecting on what had happened. They were beginning to understand the significance of their actions, but the weight of the lesson was still heavy on their hearts. They had not just disrupted the guard's duty, they had disrespected a symbol of tradition and pride. And for that, they would have to live with the consequences. As they neared the exit of the palace grounds, the lead guard finally spoke. His voice was calm, yet firm. "You are free to leave, but remember this experience. Respect is not something that can be taken lightly." His words weren't harsh, but they were a clear reminder that actions have consequences. The tourists nodded, grateful for his restraint. They had expected a much harsher punishment, but the lesson they had learned was just as powerful. Outside the palace, the tourists paused, standing together as they took in the surroundings. The sun was still shining brightly, and the sounds of the city filled the air, but it all felt different to them now. They had been humbled, and the carefree energy that had once defined their trip had been replaced with a sense of understanding they hadn't anticipated. They realized they had taken something that should have been respected, and instead had treated it carelessly. As they walked away from the palace grounds, there was a quiet resolve among them. They would never forget the lesson they had learned that day. It wasn't just about the royal guards or the traditions they represented. It was about understanding the importance of respect in all things, big and small. They may have started out as tourists looking for a bit of fun, but by the end of the day, they were different. They had been reminded that not everything in life was meant to be joked about, and that sometimes the most important lessons came when you least expected them. And from that day on, they would carry that lesson with them in everything they did.